The folks on live stream, thank you for joining us for this evening's presentation. Bill McKibben is an American environmentalist, author, and journalist who has written extensively on the impact of global warming. He serves as the Schumann Distinguished Scholar in Environmental Studies at Middlebury College. Mr. McKibben's 1989 book, The End of Nature, is regarded as the first work for a general audience about climate change. It has been published in 24 languages. He's gone on to write 20 books, and his work appears regularly in periodicals from The New Yorker to Rolling Stone. Books of his that I particularly cherish include The Comforting Whirlwind, God, Job, and the Scale of Creation, a rollicking novel, Radio Free Vermont, and his most recent, Here Comes the Sun, a persuasive and significant description of the new hopeful era now upon us, thanks to our ability to produce solar power more cheaply than fossil fuels. Bill McKibben is a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, has won the Gandhi Peace Prize, as well as honorary degrees from 20 colleges and universities. He was awarded the Right Livelihood Award, sometimes called the Alternative Nobel, in the Swedish Parliament. Foreign Policy named him to its inaugural list of the world's 100 most important global thinkers. Perhaps most importantly, on the human scale, Bill has successfully called millions, more than can be counted, to stand up and get active on behalf of our Earth. In 2008, Bill helped form the climate campaign group 350.org, and in 2021 became a co-founder of Third Act, which mobilizes people over 60 for action on climate and justice. His moral vision and clarity of purpose have inspired ordinary people, including me, to become climate activists in this country and globally. I would be remiss if I didn't mention that Bill is also witty, determined, and a first-class mensch. I imagine this crowd may not know a fact about him that I'd like to end with tonight, though I doubt I can pronounce it. In 2014, biologists acknowledged Bill McKibben's achievement by naming a new species of woodland gnat, Megothalmidia mckibbeni, in his honor. It is my great honor to welcome Bill McKibben to JTS this evening.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much for that kind introduction, and it really is a pleasure to be here for me tonight. You may not have me at my absolute best. I woke up in Miami this morning, gave a talk. By midday, I was in Trenton outside the State House in the chill wind at a protest there. On the train in, gave a talk over the Zoom. But this is the thing all fall that I've been looking forward to. I've been on the road almost all fall organizing, but I've always had in the back of my mind that I would get to be here this evening. And the reason that I was looking forward to it so much was really nostalgia. When I was a young man in this city in the 1980s, I wrote the book, The End of Nature, that was the first book about what we now call climate change, what we then called the greenhouse effect. And one of the people who read it was Steve Shaw from JTS. And he got in touch with me, and we became friends. We spent a fair amount of time together. I was over at Riverside with my congregation, and I was started and ran a homeless shelter in the basement of Riverside, so I was up here a lot in the evenings, and sometimes we'd come over, and I can remember coming. He'd had me over a couple of times to Bible study with Chancellor Shorts, and it really was quite wonderful. Most memorable, and Gordon will vouch for me on this, and if I get anything wrong, you can correct me, was a trip that Steve arranged with a bunch of rabbis along the Appalachian Trail in Connecticut, an overnight. And he had friends in many communities, and it was a great mix. There were, I believe, some Hasidic rebbes from Brooklyn, and some modern Orthodox, and some Litvak rebbes from New Jersey, and on and on and on. And most of whom had never been, I believe, in the woods before. And we hiked, it was a wonderful hike, and it was clear to me that along with along with giving a few talks about climate change, my real sort of job was I was kind of the hiking equivalent of the Shabbos Goy, which in fact one of the rabbis had left behind his talit in the van in the parking lot, so I hiked 6 miles out back and forth in the pitch dark to retrieve it so we'd have it in the morning. But the two things that I really remember was early on, we stopped for lunch early on, and we were just sitting in a clearing. And about 25 yards away, as sometimes happens in the woods, a big limb just broke off for no reason. It wasn't particularly windy or anything. Just broke off with a huge crack and smashed into the ground about 25 yards away. And there erupted this chorus of brachas from every direction, blessings for when there's been a natural wonder has occurred, when you've been spared death by divine intervention, on and on and on. It was truly remarkable. And then that afternoon, we reached the high point of this hike. And it was, we're in Connecticut, so it wasn't like we'd climbed the Matterhorn or something, but it was up on the top of a hill, and it was a beautiful open, you could see out long distance along this beautiful vista, sort of pastoral vista down into the farmland of Connecticut. And one of these rabbis who had worked hard to get up to this place, he's an older man, turned to me and he said, with enormous sincerity, said, "Now I know what Moses felt like on Mount Sinai." And I've never forgotten that, and I often sort of think that to myself when I'm up on top of a mountain. What a blessing that was. Well, Steve was a remarkable, remarkable guy, and who obviously died far too young, but the work that he had inaugurated was really important, and it's been reflected in Jewish life ever since. I got to watch the development of a kind of religious environmental movement which didn't exist in the 1980s. Across the religious spectrum, liberal congregations viewed environmentalism as something that you would get to once you dealt with poverty and war, and conservative congregations viewed it as a way station on the road to paganism. But Steve was very perceptive, and out of his work came things like Shomrei Adamah, and then the Council on Environment and Jewish Life, and now the wonderful Dayenu climate campaign, where I get to be the token Methodist on the board. It's a great pleasure. It's a deep and rich tradition now, and one that he helped inaugurate, and that I think has set deep roots. I was reminded of it all again a few weeks ago when Art Waskow died in Philadelphia, and another member of that tradition. So that's been wonderful, and the work that Steve started and that I've spent my life in, secular and religious environmentalism, has largely to this point failed. The warnings that we issued about what was happening and what was going to happen to the planet, the stuff that was in the end of nature, has now all more or less come true. And we live on a planet that is now seeing daily what happens when you raise the temperature of the earth. By far the biggest thing that humans have ever done. By orders of magnitude, the biggest thing that humans have ever done. Some of those things are dramatic and scary in a kind of daily basis. 2 weeks ago, when Hurricane Melissa hit Jamaica, the meteorological instruments that the airplanes dropped through the eye of that hurricane as it made landfall recorded at 600 feet above sea level winds of 252 miles an hour, the highest winds we've ever recorded in a hurricane, the kind of thing that can only happen when you've superheated the ocean, giving it more and more energy to draw on. That same day in central Vietnam, we had the biggest rainstorm that we've ever had recorded on this earth. In 24 hours, 5 feet of rain fell. 5 feet of rain. Among other things, that gives you, just at least for a moment, some sense of what Noah must have felt like when it started raining. That's a truly astonishing amount of water. And in the case of Vietnam, just to remind us that history never goes away, one of the things it did was wash down out of the highlands a lot of unexploded landmines and ordnance left over from our adventures in Southeast Asia. On an even deeper scale, there are now really big systemic things that are happening that are happening even faster than we thought they would. The jet stream, which draws its power from the temperature differential between the equator and the poles, now that we have warmed the poles dramatically, the jet stream gets stuck in very wonky patterns. It was quite cold last week across much of the US. That's because it was 40 degrees hotter than it was supposed to be at the North Pole, and that was pushing cold air down here. The great currents of the Atlantic Ocean, just to the east of us, the Gulf Stream and all the other currents that together are 100 times the flow of the Amazon River, the greatest heat distribution engine on the planet, they're starting to flicker and falter as fresh water pours off a melting Greenland, changing the salinity and hence the density of the North Atlantic, and that's what drives those conveyor belts. They're now in chaotic flux. I could go on, and I won't. I will add that it also seems to me a dark moment right now, because it feels to me as if our democracy is flickering and faltering as well, in ways that I don't really understand how precisely to react to. Nothing in my lifetime as an American has prepared me for what you're supposed to think when the president puts out a video showing him in a crown flying an airplane across the country, dropping poop on the heads of Americans, or when his favorite broadcaster is interviewing actual Nazis on TV. I don't really know how to react to that, except that we organize as best we can. So, with my long-standing reputation as a professional bummer-outer of other people intact, let me say that it feels very odd for me at this moment to also be bringing you very good news. The one big good thing that's happening on this planet is so big and so good that it may allow us to take a bite out of both the climate crisis and the authoritarianism crisis. And that big good thing is the very sudden, very rapid rise of clean energy on this planet. Now, we've known about sun and wind power for a long time, but we've always classified them as alternative energy, something quite marginal. That's no longer the case. In the last 36 months, there has been an extraordinary explosion in clean energy across this earth. 90% of new electric generation around the planet last year came from solar power and wind power. We're collecting a third more power from the sun this autumn than we were last autumn on planet Earth. We're at near the bottom, but very much on the steep part of the S curve now. And this acceleration, if we're able to keep it going for a while, won't allow us to stop global warming, too late for that, but may allow us to at least shave tenths of a degree off how hot the planet gets, and every tenth of a degree that we warm this Earth moves another 100 million of our brothers and sisters out of a safe climate zone and into a dangerous one. So this is the most important work that anyone could be doing. And the numbers around the world, when you see them in operation, are really staggering. This is centered in China at the moment. That's where about half of all this clean energy is going in. In May, the Chinese were putting up 3 gigawatts of solar panels a day. A gigawatt is the rough equivalent of a large coal-fired power plant. So they were building one of those out of solar panels every 8 hours, okay? In California, the place in this country that's taken it most seriously, we passed some kind of tipping point about 18 months ago. Most days now, almost every day now, California, for long stretches of the day, provides more than 100% of the electricity that it uses from renewable energy. At night, when the sun goes down, the biggest source of supply to the grid in California is batteries that have spent the afternoon soaking up excess sunshine. Those batteries didn't even exist 3 years ago. As a result, California is using about almost 40% less natural gas to produce electricity than it was 2 years ago. Okay? That is a very big change in what is, after all, the 4th largest economy in the world. And the state that's now building clean energy faster than California is the state of Texas. Not out of a commitment to do something about climate change, but out of a deep religious conviction that free markets are the most important thing in the world. And so, driven surely by the economic power of this cheap energy, they're putting it up left and right. Sometime around 5 years ago, we crossed some invisible line where it became cheaper to produce power from the sun and the wind than from burning coal and gas and oil. That was a potentially revolutionary, epochal moment for our species. The anthropologists, the archaeologists tell us that human beings have been making their way by setting things on fire for about 700,000 years. That's how long ago we can find campfires in caves, you know. And mostly it's been good. We learned to cook food. That allowed us to have the big brain, you know. We were able to move north and south from the equator. The anthropologists think that many, many eons of standing around the campfire every night produced many of the social bonds that mark our species. Think of it as a kind of proto-Zoom, you know. When we learned to control the combustion of oil and gas and coal, that was the Industrial Revolution, and it produced modernity, everything around us. So mostly fire good, but now the cost is too high. We're destroying the climate system on which we completely depend. 9 million human beings die each year from breathing the combustion byproducts of fossil fuel. That's about 1 death in 5 on this planet. There's 5 million children in New Delhi. 2.5 million of them have irreversible lung damage from breathing the air. And as long as we depend on an energy source that's only available in a few places, the people who control those few places are going to end up with more power and more wealth than they can safely have. And we have seen that time and time and time again. In this country, our biggest oil and gas barons were the Koch brothers. They control more refinery and pipeline capacity than anyone else, and I think they used their winnings to help erode the foundations of our democracy. In Europe, the biggest oil and gas baron is Vladimir Putin, who's used his to launch a land war in Europe in the 21st century. The king of Saudi Arabia, on and on and on. So it is remarkably beautiful to imagine the transition, the quick transition to a world that runs on energy that's available to everybody all the time in their own place. Energy that cannot be hoarded, cannot be held in reserve. Think about, for a minute, just do the thought experiment in your mind of what the geopolitics of this planet would have looked like over the last 100 years if oil had been of trivial value in that period. The number of wars and coups and terrorist plots and assassination attempts and on and on and on that we could have avoided. And think about the potential liberation for people across this planet who no longer have to come up with the money to pay for that scarce resource. When we hear about poor countries having a balance of payments crisis, and that the IMF is going to have to structurally adjust their economy, on and on, almost invariably the biggest reason is they keep having to come up with cash on the barrelhead US dollars to pay for the next tanker load of oil swinging at anchor in the harbor to keep their economy afloat. That's why it's beautiful to watch what's starting to happen across the developing world. In Pakistan, where no country has been harder hit by climate change. They've had the two biggest floods since Noah in the last 2010 and 2022. The last one, a third of the people in the country out of their homes. In the summertime now, in urban Pakistan, it routinely hits 120 degrees in their big cities, at the edge of human habitability. But they have one geographic advantage, which is a border with China. And across that border in the last 2 years have come huge numbers of these cheap Chinese solar panels. It's not a government project. It's just individual Pakistanis fed up with expensive and unreliable electricity, buying solar panels, going on YouTube to watch videos with Hindustani music in the background about how to snap them together. They've installed 43 gigawatts of solar power. 5 years ago, the entire electric grid of Pakistan was 43 gigawatts. So the pace at which this has happened is incredible. Those of you who've traveled in rural Asia know that the soundtrack in that part of the world is the whine and hum of diesel generators drawing water up through those deep tube wells that are the legacy of the agricultural green revolution of the 1960s. For a Pakistani small peasant farmer, buying that diesel is usually the biggest item in their budget. So they were early adopters of these things. They don't, for the most part, lacked the money to build the metal supports that we are used to seeing. They just laid the panels on the ground and pointed them at the sky. Pakistani farmers used 35% less diesel last year than they had the year before. That's a big change. And now this is spreading across Africa, any place where there are strong Chinese trade routes. It's remarkable to see. There's 700 million people in sub-Saharan Africa who don't have electricity. This is the way that they're going to get it. Coal, gas, and oil failed over 2 centuries to provide it for them. It will come from the sun and these village-scale microgrids that are now going up hither and yon. So this is potentially a really beautiful, liberating moment. But to do us much good, it has to happen fast, okay? The rules here are set by physics, not by politics. And that means that if we want to have any way of averting any of the climate crisis, it has to happen almost immediately because we've delayed so long now. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change said 3 years ago that if we wanted any hope of staying on anything like the timetable that we had laid out in Paris 10 years ago, we needed to cut emissions in half by 2030, which by my watch is now 4 years and about 10 weeks away, okay? That does not leave us much time. But we finally have this tool. For the first time in all the years we've worked on climate change, we have a scalable tool that we can put to use. Energy from the sun, from the wind, which is just another form of solar energy. The sun heats the earth differentially, creating those beautiful winds that blow across the surface of the earth and turn those majestic turbines. This is a remarkable, remarkable possibility, which makes it all the more frustrating that in this country, we're not just not seizing this opportunity, we're now doing absolutely everything we can to stamp it out. And in the ugliest possible ways. We have proclaimed now that our national creed is what the president has called energy dominance, which means that we will use all policy to make as many places around the world use our oil and natural gas as we can. It turns out that's what much of tariff policy is about. We set a tariff at 40%, and then if you agree to buy, as Europe did, $750 billion worth of liquefied natural gas, or Japan, $500 billion or whatever, then the president cuts your tariffs down to 20% or 15%. It's a shakedown ring, and it's done on behalf of an industry that you may recall, candidate Trump telling the heads of the oil industry that if they gave him $1 billion in campaign donations, they could have anything they wanted. They ended up at about $500 million, and that was enough. He has stopped work on the giant wind farms off the coast of New England, even though they were 80% complete. Last month, we ceased work on what would have been the biggest solar farm in the US, one set of arrays in Nevada that would have provided enough power for 2 million homes. That's roughly as many homes as there are in New York City. And we could have powered all of them, or the equivalent of them, with one solar farm, and now we're not going to do it because we're interested in not liberation, but dominance. And that is extraordinary sadness, and also should be a source of, I'll say in passing, some real worry too. When American historians look at this last 9 months, I think that they will be writing about our experiments with whatever kind of off-brand authoritarianism we're dabbling in at the moment. But when world historians write about it, the story they will be telling is the United States voluntarily passing economic and technological primacy on this planet to our theoretical adversary, the Chinese. And with it, a kind of political primacy too, something I think we begin to see playing out this week in Brazil, where the countries of the world, with the United States absent, are gathered to talk about the greatest challenge we face, climate change. And the Chinese are the obvious inheritors of whatever mantle of leadership we once held in this world. By virtue of their adoption of technologies that were invented right here. The first solar cell, 1954, Bell Labs, Edison, New Jersey. It's possible that might be someone in this room old enough to have been putting a dime in a payphone in the 1950s. And if you were, then you were helping fund the construction of that first solar panel. To give you a sense of how far things have traveled in the decades since, I went, when I was writing this new book, to look up the New York Times story about that. And it was on the front page, this 1954, in the spring of 1954. And it was right next to a story on the front page about happy Americans lining up to get the first polio vaccine, okay? So that gives you some sense of the declension of, of our society in the years since. So, I will say that if we are truly interested in upholding human dignity, and if we're truly interested in a future that might be less turbulent than the one we currently inhabit, that it seems to me our job is clearly to organize to change the current state of affairs. And so that's what I spend my time doing. I think that it's entirely possible to imagine a real sea change here, because people of all kinds have a deep affection for the idea that we might break with big oil and power ourselves in other ways. Let me give you a couple of examples. There's this wonderful development in Europe in the last 3 years that we're calling balcony solar, okay? If you live in Europe, you just go to whatever you call the Best Buy in Milan and put down a few €100, and you come home with a solar panel designed not to be put on your roof, but to be hung from the railing of your apartment balcony, okay? And on the back it has a plug, just a standard plug you just plug into a wall. Doesn't require an electrician, you don't have to rewire anything, and it often provides 20%, 25% of the power that an apartment uses. So not everything, but not nothing either, and it's a beautiful symbolic thing too. And all over Europe, apparently, there are now people obsessively looking at their app, just studying how much power they're producing at any given moment. That's illegal everywhere in this country, except the state of Utah, that progressive bastion, which in March, both houses of the state legislature passed the enabling legislation, passed it unanimously. The Libertarian Republican state senator who introduced it, and who I've talked to at some length, said, if this is good enough for the people of Stuttgart, it is good enough for the people of Provo. And so be it, because now you can go on YouTube and watch dozens of videos of earnest Utahns putting their balcony solar rigs up and happily watching the power pour in. There is no good reason that shouldn't happen here and everywhere. There are a lot of balconies in this city. Emily Gallagher, the assemblywoman from Greenpoint, Astoria, has introduced legislation in the state assembly to allow this to happen here. I was talking today with Liz Kruger, the wonderful state senator who's been New York's most productive environmentalist for many years now, and she says she'll do her best to get it through the Senate. Same thing, but on a slightly larger scale. Putting solar on your roof in America costs 3 times what it does in Australia or the EU. Not because the panels are more expensive. Tariffs make them a little more expensive, but they're so cheap now. The real cost is the excess bureaucracy. In the rest of the world, if you want solar power on your roof, you call up for Monday morning. By Friday afternoon, it's up there and producing power. If you call up here, it's a 3-month saga at best. We have 15,000 municipalities. Each has their own building code. Each has a team of inspectors that would like to crawl around on your roof for a while. All of it unnecessary. The National Renewable Energy Labs produced an app a couple of years ago called the Solar App Plus that allows for instant permitting. Your contractor types in the kind of panel she wants to put on your roof, types in your address. If it clicks in the database, she gets an instant permit, and she's up at work the next afternoon, which is how it is everywhere else on this planet. And if we now have that mandated in California, in Maryland, and in New Jersey, we have 47 states left to go to make that same kind of graceful thing happen. But we're doing it as best we can. We did this big day of action in September called Sun Day, and it was really wonderful. We had 500 events across the country. I was downtown with Brad Lander that day at the Friends Meeting House, the old Quaker Meeting House downtown, and it was really a wonderful group of people who gathered to kind of celebrate this occasion. We need to build that movement, and we need to build it fast. Looking at the demographics of this audience, let me say that one of the groups that needs to do that work are people with hairlines like mine. 3 years ago, we started this thing called Third Act, which organizes Americans over the age of 60. It's because young people were doing their job. There are Greta Thunbergs all over the planet doing remarkable work. But too many people were watching that. I was hearing too many people my age say it's up to the next generation to solve this problem, which is immoral, but also impractical. Young people, for all their energy and intelligence and idealism, lack by themselves the structural power to make change on the scale we need in the time that we have. So if you look around, well, the best formulation I've come up with is, if you've reached the age when you have hair coming out your ears, then you have structural power coming out your ears too, okay? And it turns out that we have about 100,000 people now across the country organized, including fantastic working groups in New York City and in upstate New York, who have become all of a sudden big forces in Albany and at City Hall in getting this stuff done. And in letting young people who really do suffer a lot from what we've called climate anxiety or climate despair, when I talk to them, it's less a kind of fear about the physical fate of the planet than a sense that they have been abandoned to deal with it on their own, okay? Which is too many times too true. The first demonstration we did at Third Act was because some young people from Fridays for the Future, the American offshoot of Greta's work with school children, called us up and said, we want to go after the big banks, Chase City, Wells Fargo, Bank of America, that are the biggest funders of the fossil fuel industry. We want to go after them, protest outside, but we don't have checking accounts or credit cards. Can you help? And I was like, if there's one thing we've got, it's credit cards. So we will help. And I remember the very first demonstration, even before Third Act had really quite legally formed, was in Boston. And we got there, and there were 300 or 400 high school kids. And the high school kids understand the barrel of the gun down which they're staring. And they're somewhat sprier, so they were at the head of the march. But at the back of the march, there were a bunch of us from this nascent Third Act with a big banner that just said, "Fossils against fossil fuels," you know? And the young people who were there, they were truly appreciative that we were there, but also that they hadn't been abandoned in quite that way. So it's been fun doing this work, and I hope very much it continues. We were very heartened, I must say, since our two jobs are to protect climate and democracy. We were very heartened earlier this fall when Stephen Miller, the president's henchman, I don't know what you'd say, was giving reporters a tour of newly militarized Washington, D.C., and boasting about all the soldiers they had on the streets and things. And he said, the only problem we're having is that all these elderly hippies keep coming out and yelling at us, you know. He said, I think they should go home and take a nap. And we said, we're not going home and taking a nap. We're going to continue to stand up. And so I hope some of you will join in that work. Join in that work because, and here I'll return to this discussion of energy, because not only is it absolutely necessary if we're at all serious about the first job God gave us, which was to protect creation. And not only is it economically advantageous, smart thing to do, let me tell you quickly that 2 weeks ago, the government of Australia, because they've put up so much solar power, the government of Australia announced that beginning in January, all Australians will get 3 free hours of electricity every afternoon. 3 free hours to run their dishwasher, their clothes dryer, to charge their EV, if they have a storage battery, to fill it with free electricity so they can run their home all night. Human beings for 700,000 years have struggled to come up with the energy to power our lives, and all of a sudden it's free if we want it, if we're willing to stand up to the vested interest that would rather sell it to us forever. So not only practically necessary, economically advantageous, but also kind of beautiful. I took the title of this book of mine from George Harrison, stole it. When you go to Spotify, it turns out that Here Comes the Sun is, of all the songs in the Beatles' vast catalog, the one that the most people listen to every day around the world, twice as many as any other song. Partly because it's a beautiful and optimistic and gentle song in a dark moment, but partly because human beings really like the sun. We don't know exactly how prehistoric people felt about things, because being prehistoric, they neglected to write it down, but they did leave behind lots of piles of stones, and all of them point to the equinox or the solstice, you know. The minute that people started inventing mythologies, the very first task was to explain how something rose in the morning here, set in the morning there, and got back over there by the next morning. So there's endless wonderful stories of giant turtles and of emus swallowing the sun and vomiting it up, and on and on and on, you know. And the sun is the most charismatic object in our corner of the universe. We needn't worship it, but we would be fools not to feel a certain affection for it. It provides us with light and with warmth and with, via photosynthesis, our supper, and now it's willing to provide us with all the power we could ever want. I was in Rome in September. The new guy in the Vatican had called some people over for a conclave about the 10th anniversary of Francis's remarkable encyclical, Laudato Si, the most remarkable piece of writing, I think, of this millennia to date, a thoroughgoing critique of modernity centered on climate change as its kind of theme. And it was a wonderful occasion. The new pope is I will report, weirdly normal American. If he showed up at your Thanksgiving table wearing a White Sox cap, you would just assume that your bachelor uncle had appeared from someplace, you know, and he would fit right in. He made clear he was going to keep the faith with everything that Francis had done on this topic. Indeed, in January or February, the Vatican will become the first fully solar-powered nation on planet Earth. They've built a big solar farm outside Rome, and they're going to flip the switch, which will be remarkable when it happens. So I said in my contribution to this that I thought from now on our mantra should be energy from heaven, not from hell. Okay? And I continue to think that we suddenly have, thanks to the God-given wit and ingenuity of human beings, a way out of some of the deepest crises that we've ever wandered into, and that it would be very literally a sin were we to waste that chance that we have been given, that we've given ourselves. So I'm very grateful to Steve Shaw for getting so much of this work going, and very grateful to the people who carry it on, and very hopeful that many of you will join in this work in the time ahead. No guarantees, but a future very much worth the fighting for. Thank you all very much. I think there's a microphone out there someplace. Questions, critique, abuse, whatever you would like. I've laid it on you heavy, so feel free to reply in kind.
Thank you for the talk, and thank you for all you've done over the years and are continuing to do. Let's see if I can figure out how to ask this question. With what you've said, and I've heard you say before, everything that the current administration and the oil companies, et cetera, are doing makes absolutely no sense. No sense economically, no sense politically, really, no sense in any way. And we talk about these interests that somehow, and it's like, how the heck do they keep it?
So,
how the heck do they keep that? And it just seems like, I understand you have, and some have been trying to wake up the world
yes.
for so long, but it's just at this point with what we're talking about technology, it's so
yes.
bizarre.
On one sense, very true. On the other hand, what they're doing makes sense. I mean, look, this is good news for everybody on planet Earth except people who own oil wells, in which case it's very bad news. I mean, at current market rates, there's $30 or $40 trillion worth of fossil fuel underground that these guys hold in their reserves. That's what their stock price is based on, the reserves that they've mapped out and seized for themselves. So that gives them the incentive to game political systems. I don't mean to be the cynic here, but our political system is such that it's all too easy for people with large quantities of money to figure out how to game it to get what they want done. So yes, the good news is that what's changed is for the first 35 years of the climate fight, we lived in a world where fossil fuel was relatively cheap and renewable energy relatively expensive. That meant that the work of climate campaigners like me was to figure out how to make fossil fuel more expensive. That's what carbon pricing was about. That's why we had this huge divestment movement, biggest anti-corporate campaign of its kind in history, $40 trillion worth of endowments that pulled, including several of the Jewish denominations that pulled their investments from coal and gas and oil in order to drive up their cost of capital. That's why we fought so hard to stop infrastructure projects like Keystone Pipeline, to keep them from consolidating new territory and things like that. But now we live in a world where that has flipped, and where now the economic force of gravity works in the right direction. And now it's the fossil fuel industry, in a strange sense, that's on the defensive, having to work hard as they possibly can to slow down what would be an inevitable transition in the right direction. And so the work of activists now is to accelerate that transition, to be a catalyst, to make it happen fast enough to catch up with the physics of climate change. The fossil fuel industry, with the shameful denial of what they absolutely knew to be the truth about climate change for 30 years, cost us valuable decades that we will never get back. And if they cost us another decade, then I think we go over a kind of set of physical limits that are horrifying to think about. But we have a tool now. So that's why I'm so committed to figuring out how to make use of it.
Any way to tell the fossil fuel companies, yes, you can make some money on renewable energy.
The head of...
And therefore you'll go with it.
Yes, this is the problem. The head of Exxon said last year, we will never invest in renewable energy because it doesn't offer, quote, above average returns for our investors. And that is true. You can make money putting up solar panels, but once you've put them up, the sun delivers the energy for free every morning when it rises above the horizon. And if you are Exxon, that is the stupidest business model anybody ever thought up, okay? If you're the entire rest of the world, it's a great blessing, okay? But breaking that power quickly is the problem now. 40 years from now, we're going to run the world on sun and wind because it's cheap. But if it takes us 40 years to get there, the world we run on sun and wind will be irredeemably broken. So that's the challenge.
Thank you for your inspiration and your help. In my household, we've been driving electric cars since they first came out, got rid of our gasoline-powered cars a long time ago. And my husband has invested in a company called Optera, which will be a car not yet produced that will be covered in solar panels. And the concern that I have, which I've never really found an answer to, is there a concern about what happens to these batteries?
Not much. This is good news, and I'm glad you brought it up. It's a whole category of things we should quickly talk about. Sometimes people will say, well, we're just going to have to mine this stuff to go in the batteries, and there's going to be so much waste and whatever. Not really. I mean, look, you do have to go mine some stuff, and mining is always a scourge and whatever, but not that much. If you think about it, you go mine some lithium to put it in a battery, okay? And there it sits for 25 years doing its lithium thing. And in fact, lithium's valuable. We now know how, when the battery degrades, to recycle it and get the lithium out and start over again, okay? When you go mine some coal, what do you do with it? You set it on fire, and then you have to go mine some more tomorrow. So the Rocky Mountain Institute, Amory Lovin's shop out in Colorado, did a study last fall saying that the total amount of mining for the renewable battery revolution by mid-century would be less than the volume of coal we mined last year on this planet, okay? So we should do it humanely and as environmentally soundly as we can, but it's a way to understand this is we're moving from energy as a commodity to sort of human ingenuity as a commodity. You know, we get better and better at building. Every time we double the amount of solar panels on the planet, the price drops 20% because we've gotten better at doing it. And that does not happen with coal and gas and oil. In your mind's eye, remember that a boatload full of solar panels will in its lifetime produce more than 100 times as much energy as a boatload of coal, okay? And then when we're done with the solar panels, when they've begun to, after 30 or 40 years, to degrade, we now are able to recycle them. And because we're getting better at this each year, so I've had solar panels on my roof for 25 years. They're still going strong. But when we take them down eventually to replace them with newer ones, the minerals that are in those solar panels, there's some silver, there's some boron, there's some other things. One of those circa 2,000 solar panels has enough of that stuff in it to produce 6 circa 2025 solar panels. So it's not like a circular economy, it's like a Mobius strip, you know? It's really quite remarkable what the human brain can accomplish when it gets on one of these cycles. And we're nowhere near the bottom of it. Even if we began to run short of things like lithium, we'd figure out something else to do. So in China now, in the last 2 years, you can go buy cars that run on sodium-ion batteries, all right? Sodium is the 5th most common element in the Earth's crust. If you go 2 miles south to the battery and dip a bucket over the wall, you have all the sodium you will ever need, out there in the Atlantic Ocean to keep you going. So we're not going to run out of stuff, I don't think. That's not the problem. Humans are all too good at finding stuff. You'll remember 15 years ago, there were a lot of people worried about peak oil and we were going to run out of oil. If only, that would have been the greatest blessing to the planet that we could possibly have had. But no, we're good at tracking stuff down and finding it. Oh, I'm sorry, someone.
Thanks. Can you talk a little bit about the debacle of plastics? And with that, is there any benefit to advocacy to companies to convert from plastic bottles to aluminum cans and stuff, or are we wasting our time? Thank you.
So plastics are a very big problem. And in fact, for the fossil fuel industry, as they begin to make it, as we begin to drive down the demand for natural gas, one of the things they try to do is make more plastic. You can use natural gas for plastic, and that's one of the things they're trying to replace it with. We obviously need to use a lot less of it for all kinds of reasons, having to do with what it's doing, you know, on terrestrial communities and especially in marine ecosystems and things. So breaking the political power of the fossil fuel industry would be the biggest help here in doing something about accelerating use of plastic. It's their political power that's the problem. The plastic industry, for instance, a couple of years ago, there was a great piece in the Times about how they had dispatched a veritable army of lobbyists off to Africa. A lot of African countries had banned plastic bags because they clog the sewers. If you've spent much time in the developing world, you know that they often clog fairly primitive sewer systems and things. So they've had a big interest in getting rid of them, and they're not, you know, they have living memory of using cloth bags and stuff, so it's not that hard. The plastics industry dispatched an army of lobbyists to overturn all those laws in African countries, and they said quite explicitly, we don't think Africa is using anywhere near enough plastic. We're going to try and make sure they use some more. That was as directly amoral a thing as I'd ever read. The only way to beat anything like that is to break their political power, which basically means undercut their basic source of income, which is selling oil and gas. So that's one of the side benefits of the work that we're underway here, I think.
Bill, you've given us great optimism with respect to the technology that you've been describing. You've also written about some of the darker sides of technology, or at least some of the challenges of it. And its impact possibly on the whole sense of what humanness is. And one of the memorable things for me that what you've written is that, and it gets really to human dignity, that part of our human power is the ability not to do something that we are capable of doing.
Exactly right.
So I wonder if I could coax you to just reflect a little bit for a couple of moments about that aspect of this, your work in the human dignity.
Sure. Look, we're inevitably now creatures of technology to one degree or another. And it's not, it is, it's silly, I think, to imagine in the short run that we're going to deeply change sort of human desires and wants and things. Over the long run, 100 years from now, I think we're such an interesting species that we will have figured out far more interesting ways of amusing ourselves than buying stuff. I don't think the kind of consumer capitalism phase that we're going through will last forever. But I also don't think that it's going to change soon enough to have much effect on the climate, say. 100 million humans enter the consuming class now every year, mostly in Asia, and I think they're going to tread the path that we have blazed before them in a lot of ways. So our job, I think, is to figure out how to accommodate that with as little damage as possible. And that means using technologies that are as light as possible on the earth around us. And that's one of the things I really like about solar energy and wind energy. They move us at least one stage down this chain because we're able to control them much more locally. We're able to build them ourselves. No one's going to put a nuclear power plant on their balcony, okay? But you can put a solar panel on your balcony. No one's going to, these are things that are more human scale and in touch than what we've been using in the past. And they connect us with the world again in, I think, interesting ways. To be thinking about the sun more and the wind is a beautiful thing for human beings. When Steve Shaw and I were first talking about all these things long ago, when we were out hiking and things, one of the things we talked a lot about was my great fascination with the book of Job, which is there's many biblical scholars here who are much more attuned than me, but I believe that God's soliloquy in the end of the book of Job is the longest speech that God ever delivers anywhere. I could be wrong, but I think that's the case. And it's the most beautiful piece of nature writing in the Western tradition, the first and most beautiful. Deeply biologically accurate and crunchy and sexy and just magnificent, If you haven't read it for a while, go read, I recommend the Stephen Mitchell translation because I think it's fantastic. It's also very sarcastic. God is just taunting Job the whole time. If you're so smart, Job, tell me, where do I keep the storms? Can you whistle up a blizzard? Can you tell the proud waves where to break? And after 3 chapters of this, Job's just like, okay, can I sit down now? He's had enough of this lecture. That's always been the human posture in regard to the world around us, to the natural world, and to God. It's big and we're small. The forces of the natural world, overwhelm. That's what the job of humans was, to figure out how to somehow survive in the face of them. Until sometime in the middle of the last century, when we started to get all of a sudden very, very, very large. Our first intimation was the explosion of the bomb at Alamogordo. And of course, that's when Oppenheimer looked at it and said, from the Gita, we have become as gods, destroyers of worlds. The mushroom cloud was vivid enough in our imaginations that so far we've been able to avoid repeating it. Okay? But we weren't able to imagine the explosion of billions of pistons in billions of cylinders every second of every minute of every hour all over the world, creating the same damage. It does. The heat equivalent, by putting carbon in the atmosphere, we capture heat equivalent to about 400,000 Hiroshima-sized explosions every day on this planet, okay? That's why the ice caps are melting. It takes a lot of heat to melt, millennia-old, meters-thick, continent-sized piece of ice. Where Job had to admit to God that he was small, part of this large, buzzing, mysterious, cruel, beautiful creation, when we're able to just taunt God right back. Do you set the barriers for the waves? Tell the proud waves, here you shall break and no further? Job has no idea, but we're like, yes, of course, we set how high the seas are going to go now. It's entirely dependent on how much carbon we put into the atmosphere or don't. That's a human decision. And so it seems to me, and again, I'm no theologian, but it seems to me that our job is clearly to figure out how to make ourselves a little smaller, and that the technologies that we should favor are the ones that make us a little bit smaller over time, and that fits not only the physical needs of the planet, but the moral needs of the people on it. The fact that there will never be solar, trillionaires is a good thing, not a bad thing. The fact that you works best at the scale of the community is a good thing, not a bad thing. The fact that you can't imagine energy dominance from the sun and the wind is a good thing, not a bad thing. And so it's one of these cases where advances in technology change the way that we can imagine the world around us. And that's a beautiful, beautiful thing, I think.
I think we have time for one more.
One more, absolutely.
We said one more, but I want to ask you two unrelated questions, but short ones. One, we talk about solar and wind. What's with wave energy? Second, what is AI doing to our electricity needs?
What is
AI
okay,
doing
yeah,
to
sure.
our electricity needs?
So first, wave energy. The power of the tides is large, though not enormous on this scale. The real problem so far has been that marine environments are deeply difficult to work in. They're corrosive. Salt water rusts everything very fast. So we're getting closer to being able to do some stuff with tides, and there'll be a bunch of things that'll help some. Geothermal power, tidal power, maybe we'll get small modular nuclear reactors at some point that are cheap enough to be of use, on and on. But in the time that we have to deal with this crisis, the real tools we have are sun, wind, and batteries. That's the stuff that's there ready to go. And that's the message I think to get across. I mean, we've been thinking of this our whole lives as I say, as alternative energy. We think of it still as like the Whole Foods of energy, Nice, but pricey for special people, It's not. It's the Costco of energy, okay? It's cheap, it's available in bulk, it's on the shelf ready to go. If we get that message out, then we're good. And this is especially true when it comes to AI and data centers. Now, I'm agnostic on the question of whether we actually need or are even going to build a lot of this stuff. I think there's a pretty good chance that this turns out to be a bubble, and that 2 years from now we're wondering why we thought we were going to commit trillions of dollars worth of capital to producing a product that so far is basically good at letting kids cheat on their homework, But let's assume that we have to do it and somehow have to do it really fast so that we can get ahead of the Chinese. I don't understand that part either particularly, but let's assume that somehow we have to. The only way to do this fast is to do it with solar farms and renewable energy. It takes years to build gas-fired power plants. You can put up a solar farm in a matter of weeks once you have the, permitting, whatever. And that's what the technology, big reports out of Silicon Valley saying exactly this, which just makes it so strange that our administration has decided that A, we should permit any data center that anyone wants to build, and B, we should constrict artificially the supply of energy by saying we can't build sun and wind. I'm no more a great economist than I am a great theologian, but if you increase demand and constrict supply, price is going to go up. The price of electricity is already up 10% this year across America. It's probably going to be one of the biggest issues in the midterm elections, the elections that may decide whether we become a fascist nation or not. So we better spread the idea very quickly that the reason that the price of energy is going through the roof is precisely that we're not building the cheapest possible forms. And I do think it's worth spreading to everybody the one nugget of news I gave you a little while ago, which is that beginning in January, all Australians get 3 free hours of electricity every day. If I was running for office, that's what I'd be saying. If you want to talk about affordability, which is what everybody wants to talk about after Mr. Mamdani's campaign, if you want to talk about abundance, which we've been talking a lot this year, that's what it looks like in real human form. Free electricity for human beings as much as they could use. That's as close to the angels as we are likely to get in our lifetime, so we should figure out how to do it here and everywhere. Many thanks, friends.